Welcome to Comics in Dialogue. Bienvenidos a Comics in Dialogue. This is an event some teachers from the Department of English Studies here at the University Complutense, Universidad Complutense, and some instructors and researchers from other universities have been working on for some months. We hope you enjoy and participate in all the activities that we have prepared for you, the talks, the interviews, the roundtables, okay? And we're going to introduce this event, okay, with the help of the Dean of our school, Eugenio Luján, and Asunción López Varela from the Department of English Studies. They will inaugurate Comics in Dialogue. Toma la palabra primero en este acto de inauguración Eugenio Luján, decano de la Facultad de Filosofía de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Eugenio.
Ok, muy bien, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todos en España. Hello to everyone, and well, good evening to those of you who are in Europe and in neighboring areas, and good morning to those of you who are in other areas. We are very happy to host this international conference at our faculty, at our school, and our university. It is really a pleasure to be here with you in the opening session today, because if usually it is very hard to be able to organize a conference, it's been really an adventure to go on with the organization of this international conference, Comics in Dialogue. And I would like to, first of all, to congratulate all my colleagues who have been in charge of organizing it, all the members of the organizing committee, both those who belong to the Complutense University of Madrid and those who belong to other universities and institutions, because it's been really a big effort to go on with the organization of such a big event like this in these difficult times. The conference is going to be a success, I'm sure about that, because I have seen the final program. I mean, I have been aware of all the organization and all the arrangements that have been made during a long time, because my colleagues have informed me about this. But I have read the final program, and I can say that I'm sure it's going to be a great success. Because of many things. First of all, because of the high quality of the people who are participating in it. Not only the organizers themselves, because many of them, all of them in fact, are experts in the area, in this area of comic and neighboring areas. But also because of the high quality of the guest speakers. We are going to have today the first keynote speaker, Mr. Vishwajyoti Ghosh from India, and he's going to be followed by many other key speakers, and all of them have done interesting things in this world as authors and people who have worked on comics. So it's going to be really, really interesting. On the other hand, also the people who have submitted their papers to the conferences have made a wonderful job. And I think that all of us who are going to have the opportunity of watching the videos they have uploaded in YouTube are going to have a wonderful possibility to go through all this information, this well of information that is going to be there, and not only for those who can attend during the conference, but also for the people who will be able to look at them after the conference is over. That is one of the advantages of having these online conferences. We miss the direct contact with colleagues and with people coming from other places, from other countries. But we also have some advantages. One of the advantages is that we can reach more people, and people who wouldn't have been able to come to Madrid for the conference are going to be able to follow it on the internet. So this is something that we couldn't have done I don't know, like 5-10 years ago, but now, in spite of the pandemics, that is conditioning everything now, but in spite of these pandemics, we are able to go on with the organization of such wonderful events like the one we are opening today. I don't want to be very long because I don't want to take the time of the conference. We are here to listen to our keynote speaker today, and then to participate in the discussions and all the activities that have been organized. But I would like to, again, to say thank you to all the members of the organizing committee. I would also like to thank the scientific committee. I cannot go through all the names because the list is really impressive. They have ensured the quality of the papers that are going to be delivered during these 4 days. And I want to thank them because this is also hard work, and sometimes it is not acknowledged in the way it should. But without the work of the scientific committee, we wouldn't have such a good selection as we have for this conference. I would also like to thank all the partners who have supported this international conference. I cannot read all the names, but there are so many important institutions, both public and private institutions. I would like to mention especially the Embassy of India in Spain, because thanks to them, we are having our guest speaker today, and we want to thank them for their collaboration. Since the very moment that we contacted them, they were willing to support the conference and to join us in this in the organization of this conference. I would also like to thank all the guest authors. The list, again, once more, is impressive. I have been looking at it just a few moments ago again, and all the authors and all the scholars that are going to participate as keynote speakers are really first-rank scholars, first-rank authors, and they are going to make this conference a big success. I would also like to mention that the organization has been very smart, and let me explain why I'm saying that. Because it is difficult to shift from the original plan. It was difficult to shift from face-to-face conference as it was planned originally, but then this combination of live sessions that we can follow in streaming, the combination of these live sessions with video recorded presentations and panels, and also video recorded round tables, is really a very good organization. And it allows for finding the balance between having contact, even if this is online contact, but having contact with the people who are participating in the conference, and on the other hand, giving the possibility of presenting a number of papers and delivering a number of papers that are going to contribute very much to the success of this conference. Furthermore, the organization in all these areas that have been identified, like literature and adaptation, languages, translation, and activism and feminism, I think that also shows the strength and the potential of a field like a comic, and the importance of analyzing it from different perspectives, not only from the perspective of cultural studies or fine arts and visual arts, but also from semiotics, from literature, and other so many points of view and approaches that are going to be present during this conference. So I'm sure, as I was saying before, that it's going to be a big success. It's going to be a relevant conference about comic. And I want to finish once more by congratulating all the people who have been involved in the organization. Thank you very much for your effort, especially in these difficult times. And thank you very much for being so brave as to go on with the organization of this conference, even in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemics that is conditioning our lives. But as we can see with events like this, it's not preventing us from going on with the activities that we should be organizing and promoting. So thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this opening session.
Thank you, Eugenio. Muchas gracias. And now, Asunción López Varela from the Department of English Studies would also like to pronounce some words and introduce the conference. Asunción López Varela, subdirectora del Departamento de Estudios Ingleses de la Facultad de Filología. Asunción.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I would like to also join our dean in thanking the organizing committee and the organizers for inviting me to open this event. As our dean has mentioned, the organization of this conference has not been easy. It was planned for last April, and it had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And the structure of the conference was already very complicated because, as you know from the title, Comics in Dialogue, it was meant to create a dialogue between authors, readers, and critics. And the final online format in combined streaming and recorded sessions has also been very challenging, and trying to maintain this dialogical framework. So this conference is also important because it's the first conference on comics taking place in Madrid and at Complutense University. It's important because public perception on comics and graphic novels is shifting. From, for example, in the 80s when Art Spiegelman published his Holocaust memoir, Mouse, and received the Pulitzer Prize for it. You know? Nowadays, a growing number of scholars are beginning to embrace comics as a serious field of academic study. For a semitician like me, comics and graphic novels offer the unique opportunity to explore the integration of multiple codes of signs and forms of representation. Novels like Mouse or Chris Ware, Jimmy Corrigan, or Merjan Satrapi's Persepolis, or Alison Bechdel Van Home are only some examples of how these new hybrid literary forms are merging text and image while addressing serious themes and for discussion. Chris Ware, for example, inquires into the themes of loneliness and alienation. Alan Moore's Watchmen approaches issues of moral responsibility. Rosemary Elizabeth Simmons, or also known as Posey Simmons, deals with social relations in her works, and all of which are based on canonical literary fiction. So during this conference, you will be able to learn much more about these authors and many others, like our guest speaker today, Vishwajyoti Ghosh, if I pronounce it correctly, from India. And we also have the North American Peter Cooper. We have the German Uli Kuss, and the Scottish Tom Gold, who will also be given some talks during the conference. The organization of this conference has also been particularly challenging, as our dean has mentioned, because of the number of collaborating institutions. And we can mention, I'd like to mention some of them: Comunidad de Madrid, several universities, including Complutense, la UNED, el CEU, of course, the Indian Embassy, as our dean has mentioned, el Instituto Colombiano de las Artes del Humor, ACD Comic, the British Council, the Goethe Institute, l'Alliance Française, el Institut Français, el Foro Cultural de Austria, the European Association of Comparative Literature, the One Asia Foundation, And as well as several projects, for example, Aglaria, which explores myth criticism, and Mired at TEU, which explores intermediate micro narratives. So one of the big merits of this conference is the collaboration of all these institutions. Without their support, we wouldn't have been able to carry on with this conference. And the support provides a clear case for the importance of comics and graphic novels in our contemporary society, as well as for the future of the university, which, like the comic and the graphic novel, needs to adapt to social changes, including technological changes, and bring in a dialogue with other institutional partners, providing avenues for new forms of knowledge transfer and impact across diverse social sectors. So let me finish by congratulating the team, the organizing committee, and all of those institutions that have been involved in making this comic in dialogue a success. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Asunción. And now we turn to the first activity of Comics in Dialogue. Xiana, our colleague from the Department of English Studies, presents our opening session with the Indian author, Mr. Ghosh.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Welcome to the opening talk of Comics in Dialogue. And it's for me a great pleasure on behalf of the organizing committee of Comics in Dialogue to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Ghosh. Mr. Ghosh is an Indian graphic novelist and artist engaging mostly on social and political themes. In 2019, he put together a series of graphic collage, reinterpreting classified ads in a collection of postcards titled Times New Roman and Countrymen. His graphic novel, Delhi Calm, was published in 2010. In it, Mr. Ghosh brings together realistic comic passages with political commentaries and fantastical elements in order to remember a particular incisive and controversial discussed period from 1975 to 1977, referred to in India as the emergency. In 2013, he curated this Side That Side, Race Story Partition. It is an anthology of graphic narratives by 48 illustrators and authors from Southern Asia on the partition on the Indian subcontinent. Mr. Sacco, which is a pioneer of modern and comic reporting, he has said about him, quote, "This astonishing collection of talent from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh examines the human need for something other than what history and its markers dictate." According to Sacco, this comic reporting is a collection that is beautiful, moving, and unforgettable. The Comics Journal also has described Ghosh as, quote, "an original and talented comic illustrator with a serious interest in social matters," unquote. His graphic narratives have been published in magazines and anthologies in India and abroad. Ghosh has worked together on many occasions with other comic artists across the globe. And with the POW Collective, for example, which he is a co-founder, he has published several collections of short stories. Ghosh lives in New Delhi, and today he's here with us to share his personal background, his work, his techniques, and his vision. Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this conference. It's absolutely wonderful. I never thought this will happen, but finally it's happened. So I'm really happy and to connect with all of you. And big thank you to all the organizers. I mean, it was a very difficult time we have all gone through. But to have a conference which we had all lost hope for, and now we are putting it back together, it's a great feeling. So thank you. A big thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And as a brief introduction, Mr. Ghosh has kindly prepared a short video presentation that will precede his opening talk. I will project it first, and then his lecture will be followed by a 15 minutes time slot for questions and for comments at the end. And so as a reminder to our conference participants and our viewers, please remember that you can send your comments and questions through our YouTube chat. Those will be monitored and will be read in the last 15 minutes of our session in order to create a space for dialogue and exchange around our conversations around comic. So now, without further delay, let's start. I'm going to project the video first.
Hi, I'm Vishwajyoti Ghosh. I am a graphic novelist based in New Delhi, India. I have been doing graphic novels for over 10 years now. I have done around a couple of anthologies, one solo album, and one anthology that I have curated and edited with 48 artists from South Asia. So it's been a hectic and a challenging journey. When I was in school, I wanted to get into art school. And when I went into art school, I found a fascinating world of drawing and painting and illustrations. So I actually wanted to be a children's book illustrator as a career. And there were some artists illustrators who actually fascinated me. I mean, I would see each of their work, go to each of their exhibition, follow them, tail them literally. And I had every book of theirs. And I would try and draw like them, try and think like them. And then I was a part of one Indian illustrators exhibition that happened in Bologna in 1992 or 93. I was just too honored to be a part of that show and have my work there along with the legends. And for me, that was a great influence. And I really wanted to do children's book illustrations as a career, till I realized that it might not be so economically feasible for me. So I went into advertising, television and all of that, and did many things. But I think that journey also helped me because a lot of my stories actually came from that world as well. But I never stopped practicing drawing. A lot of my work is actually influenced with the world I live around. So the universe that I create on my pages is basically around 20 meters around my house. And it's a fascinating space for me because so much happens. And in the times we live in, so much really happens. And there is fantasy, there is speculative fiction, there is nostalgia, there is tension, there is stress, there is challenges. So there are so many things that happen in our daily, mundane, day-to-day lives that for me, it's fascinating to blend a lot of the genres of graphic novels or speculative fiction or comics into my daily mundane life. And for me, that is very interesting. So in terms of the influence, on one side, there is Harvey Peaker's American Splendor or Robert Crumb. On the other side, there is Chris Ware, who also talks about his Midwestern life. But for me, mixing them together with things that can possibly be happening but are actually not happening or should be happening is an interesting space for me to explore. So I try doing that. I try blending fact with fiction, and I want to create my work in such a space where people can't figure out where does fiction end, where do facts begin, or vice versa. So often I am told after reading my story from a reader that, is it a true story? and I usually leave it to the reader that you figure it out. I mean, you think whether this could have happened or not, or whether did this happen, or should this have happened, or how did it happen? I leave that to you. So for me, creating that blend is really challenging and interesting, because I think fact on its own is too pure, and fiction on its own is too much of a fiction, and bringing the mundane with the fantasy is something maybe that really works for me. And that's something I really enjoy doing in that sense. A lot of my work has actually been termed political, is actually construed political, and that's true. I mean, in the sense, my first book was about the dissent in democracy and how democracy was challenged in the 1970s. And it's completely political. The second book that I curated was actually about the partition of India and subcontinent, which made three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So that too was political. But within that political space, I'm always looking for cultural forms, cultural expressions, cultural diversions, which actually make the political statement stronger of that day. And how do I use that form, that expression, that protest, that song, that theater, that pamphlet into my work, into a graphic narrative, into a comic, is always my challenge. And so for me, I'm actually not working only on pen and paper. I'm actually working through songs, through music, through films, through documentaries, through newspaper clippings, all of that. I'm negotiating all of that and putting that into my work, into a graphic narrative. And for me, it's always fun, because I mean, it's a great way of expressing another form of medium into another, and merging it into a graphic narrative, because it brings a lot of audience from a different diverse discipline. So people who have not read a graphic novel before, but as a songwriter, can actually now read a graphic novel and say, okay, my work is there, and vice versa. So for me, that is always an influence and a challenge.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Ghosh, opening talk.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. And it's a really interesting conference. I went through the plan and all of that, and it's actually quite fascinating. I mean, I wish I can read all the papers soon, and I want to know as much as all that is happening. So for me, it's quite fascinating to be a part of this world, because graphic novels in Europe are very different from graphic novels in India and graphic novels from America. So it's interesting to see all of that together, coming together, people, students from different perspectives talking about graphic novels. And having this university conference on graphic novels itself is very fascinating. And I'll come to that in my talk. Why is it very personally fascinating for me to talk about graphic novels and comics in an academic space? So without much time, I will start with my presentation. And I'm very happy about the title of this conference, this Comics in Dialogue. The reason I say that is because comics itself is a form of dialogue, because comics is actually an interaction between two forms. It's an interaction and a dialogue between text and visuals, and they are both talking to each other. So they are negotiating spaces, they're negotiating story. They are looking at the same story in a different way. Each of them have their own role. So for me, it's also a dialogue between two forms. A lot of the times we are asked this question, especially if you are a writer and who's collaborating with the artist, that how do you guys stand each other? How can you guys even come together on a single page? And for me, it's a challenging question, because I, for one, do not collaborate. I write my own stories and I draw my own stories. I tried collaborating once and my friendship broke away. So for me, it's impossible to think how do they collaborate, but people do a fascinating job of it. So for me, the whole practice itself is a form of dialogue. So I'm going to start how I am negotiating with these two forms, the style and the substance, the art and the text. And for me, that's the basic crux of comics, and how engaging with these two practices itself is now, for me, it's having a dialogue with these two. So, I'm going to start with a little presentation of mine, which I'm going to now open up and share with you guys. Where am I? Okay, no, wait. Just a sec, yeah. So, yeah. Where am I? Yes. Oops. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So yeah, so there I go. Bring your shared window to the front. So can I go on? Can I go on?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
To open.
Yeah. So okay. So I'm going to start with my thing of my own dialogue between comics, the dialogue between form and content. And my journey with comics actually starts from it's not that something that I really wanted to do from as a child, as you saw in the video. It's not something that came to me as like when I grew up I want to be a comic artist. No, it starts with me with the basic passion for drawing, passion for actually documenting that is happening around me. So as a kid, I would draw whatever was happening in my life, whatever was happening in my home, whatever was happening in my playground, my friends, my family, and all of that. So for me, reading visuals, as I came to know later, as Chris Ware says, this is, as children we learn what things are, and we slowly learn to dismiss them visually. So we are so engaged as adults in words and concepts that we spend all the time thinking and worrying about our past and the future, but we don't really engage in terms of a visual engagement, which is so primary, which is so essential in terms of comics, and also the way we look at the world. So Chris Ware puts this beautifully, and this is something that has stayed with me, is to because as we all know, then the God lies in the details, but then the visual details is something that makes the story much more interesting. So there I begin. So as a kid, as I told you, I did not want to become a comic artist, but in college I wanted to become a children's book illustrator. So there was a lot of these children's books that were part of our childhood, which were published in India both by the government and the private institutions, and they had the best illustrators of those times. So for me, a lot of these illustrations actually somehow gave me that inspiration to think visually. This was also the time, this is early 90s, when India was changing, in the sense the markets were opening up, liberalization had just started in, the MNCs, the multinational companies were coming into India, and India was going through a sense of schism. It's a kind of a certain confusion. So this illustration is again by a children's book illustrator, one of the very famous children's book illustrator, Mickey Patel, and he puts this so beautifully. You have a bullock cart, and you have a woman on it who's actually looking at a desktop. So this was the India we were going through in our own heads. So so when I wanted to do children's book illustration, I wanted to do work like this, which was experimental in nature, which was talking about contemporary India. But a lot of the children's book illustrations actually were retelling a lot of mythologies, which was not which is not something I was interested in. So
Mr. Ghosh, yes. Sorry to interrupt. Are you projecting a PowerPoint, or you haven't started projecting anything yet? We can only see some files in your laptop, but in your desktop. Oh, I don't know if you have already opened and you are passing on the slides, because we can't see the slides. We just can only see your different documents.
Okay, so I'm so sorry.
No. I just wanted to check, just in case. Sorry. Yeah, I guess you just, you need to open the PowerPoint.
Can you see nothing?
We just see a list of files. But...
Oh, dear. Wait.
Okay.
Wait. Oh, you see a list of files, is it?
Yeah, without
let me oh dear. I will do one thing then.
Now, yes. Now we can see it. Now we can see the slide. So
what, I'm not so sure. Can you see
now,
something?
Yes, exactly.
Can you see the first frame?
Yeah, now we see style is the substance.
Yes.
Perfect.
And can you see the second one now, Chris?
Yes. Okay.
Sorry, I'm really sorry.
No worries.
I thought I was technically proficient, but I'm not. Okay, so I'm sorry. So yeah, so basically this is my beginning. I mean, as I said, I mean, the Chris Ware quote is actually what puts it, because I mean, we are trying to engage with words and concepts, but we're not trying to engage with the world visually. So for me, this is the most important thing, is to engage with the world visually as much. Okay, so this is where I begin. I begin with doing children's book illustrations. This is not my work, but in college, I wanted to become a children's book illustrator. And I thought it was a fascinating world. And I really practiced myself up, and I became engaged with a lot of children's book illustrations and all of that. I even did a few textbooks for children. But for me, it wasn't working, because a lot of the children's book was actually retelling of the mythological stories that we hear in India. But I was not something really interested, because I was more interested in the contemporary space. And this is the space that actually fascinates me, because this is the time when India was changing. In the sense, you have this bullock cart, you have a lady on it, and who's looking at the desktop. So this was the India in the early 90s, when the markets had just opened up. Multinational companies were coming to India. So from socialist India, we were moving to a corporate privatized India. So for me, this was a very interesting, confused space for the nation to be in. And this was again by one of the very famous illustrators, Mickey Patel, whose work really fascinated me. And a lot of the children's book illustration work was actually happening with a lot of experimentation, all of that. I wanted to work in this space. Yeah. So in case anyone who can't see, please stop me and I'll go back to that slide. So this is where I begin. And then I am already by now in the mid 90s, I have finished my college and everything. And I am now coming to the world of contemporary comics, and biggest influence for me to begin with was the French comic scene, which was the bande dessinée. And a lot of contemporary work was happening on that front, and that really fascinated me. What L'Association was doing, what Satrapi was doing, what Guy Delisle was doing. So these guys actually quite fascinated me. And I will just talk about three people who were key in terms of my influences, or I mean, there are more influences, but for the sake of the talk, I'll just keep on these three. Because they're closest to the kind of work that I do. One, of course, is Chris Ware, who I have quoted, who again talks about his Midwestern life, boring, mundane life, confused, all of that put together. And he often talks about the same story from different perspectives. So notice the same, he's talking about the same house here, it's the same house, but then he has two different characters looking at it. So for me, this looking at the story from multiple perspectives is very fascinating. The fact that it's coming from his own neighborhood, his own life is very fascinating. So that's one. The other one is, of course, Joe Sacco, who is quite a pioneer in comic reportage. And it's interesting the way he builds up his stories. He builds up the perspectives. Most of the times he's talking about a world he is not personally involved in, or he's not from, but the way he picks up his reportage, it's very clear that he's middle of it all, and his sense of empathy lies there. So for me, that is very fascinating. And the third one is a French artist called Edmund Godwa, who is again talking about all that is going on in one's head, contemporary life, and all of that. And the reason I always mention him is his sense of drawing really fascinates me. Every time I look at his work, I feel like I wish I could draw like him. So from there, I moved to my own comics, and you will see their influences somewhere in my work. This is one of the first comics I did. It's called SMS to Passport. Now, this is the time when we had mobile phones in our hands, but we didn't have WhatsApp or we didn't have any other form. So SMS was the best option. This story is actually is set in the metro train in Paris, and is actually an engagement and a dialogue with a undocumented Pakistani worker who has just come into Paris 3 days back. He cannot speak English, he cannot speak French. He only knows his native language, Punjabi. So I keep an eye contact with him and we get talking. And he tells me his own plan and how he has moved. He has completely moved through an illegal way, and he tells me his journey and all of that. And for me, it's a fascinating journey. And he's shocked to know that I have come all this way and I'll go back to my own country. And he said, why will you go back? You should stay back, do whatever. And he knew the immigration policies and everything. So, I mean, clearly, this was one of the most fascinating stories for me to start with. And it's called SMS to Passport because all through the train journey, he kept sending an SMS to someone or the other. It could be someone of his new friends here or his hometown. I don't know. But for me, it was a fascinating world that he brought to me. So I kept a document of that in a comic form. Look at the influence of Godwa in this. Yeah. There were other drawings that I did in Paris, again, which were more of the contemporary, from a contemporary perspective. This is an Indian place called Gare du Nord, which is the Indian place. Most of the Indians joins there. And there was a place called Gandhi Fried Chicken, and Gandhi was a vegetarian. So I was wondering how would have Gandhi reacted to this kind of a space? There was a lot of talk about the Sex and the City, not the show, but the whole fact that lonely people would connect through these metro ads and all of that. So I kept drawing about the place, and that sense of drawing has somehow stayed with me. So whenever it's a new place I go to, I talk to people. So there's a sense of dialogue. I keep talking to them, and something or the other keeps on coming. So even if it's a micro story, I keep talking about it in a comic form, and I usually keep a journal. Not something I'm very good at, but I try to do that. So again, this is on the spot kind of a drawings that I do, the doodles, scribbles, or whatever. And for me to just document, and I keep using that in my other work, which you will see in some form or the other. This is again a statement of the Swiss society. As you know, the Swiss every town has only three things which are common. One is a lake, one is a church, and one is the departmental store called Migros. Every city will have a Migros, and all that they consume is actually a lot of Migros. So for me, this was a fascinating space because in the country I come from, it's never so unidimensional. So I collect a lot of material. I collect bills. I collect newspapers and all that, and I put together. This was again. This is actually a comic of a video. So this is a video I had seen of an illegal immigrant who's talking about how to survive without catching the eye of the police. So for me, the whole video was shot without the face and only hand movements. So I just thought, let me keep a document of this in my own comic way, and I put together this kind of a piece. Yeah. So a lot of the stories that I work on now actually come from the world I live in. As I said, the 20 meters around my universe. Again, there's a lot of contemporary influence. There's a lot of influence of the spoken word. How do people talk? How do people negotiate? So this was a friend's story. He had lost his cell phone, and then how he got the police to actually illegally trace it and get it back to him. So this was corruption, malfunction, all of that put together to get things right. So we often do wrong things to get things right. So this was a story of that. So the contemporary space, the society I live in, keeps playing a role in my work, my travels in the metro train, my travels and talking to strangers, talking to passers-by, talking to co-travelers, keep forming my work. But what is also very interesting for me is to go back to the dialogue, go back to that story and reframe it, process it in a form. And what happens is, where I come from is the beginning. So the influence of memory. Now, this is a very important phase of my work, because when we were in school, we were moving from the written word to the visual space. Comics had just about come in. It's not that when we were born, comics came in. No, comics was probably born in our country after we were born. So I was in class grade 2 or something when comics came in. And the reason I said it's very interesting for me to talk about comics in an academic university spaces, because in school, comic reading was a banned exercise. We were not allowed to read comics because comics would take away your reading habit. So we had only long form, like the picture books I had shown you. So we started with these comics from our own mythologies, from this brand called Amar Chitrakatha. And this was a great influence on us, because these comics were dime a dozen. They were like produced one practically every day. And there were these comics of our gods, goddesses, legends, histories, and all of that. And a lot of us actually learned our mythologies and our gods, goddesses through these comics. They were very cheap, but they were still expensive than a proper book. So this comic, the one that I'm showing right now, was 1 rupee 75 paisa, which would basically mean 0.02 euro. I mean, it's not even coming in pence or whatever, shillings or whatever. I don't know. So I don't know how much will that be. So it was that cheap. Now this would be about €1.50. So these comics were fascinating, the way they created a world for us, and they were a part of our childhood. So, and it's an unshakable part of the childhood. So now I use this particular style in a comic. So the founder of this particular brand died a few years back, and I did a tribute to him using his comics. Now these are visuals from comics that they produced, Amar Chitrakatha produced. So I put that in a contemporary perspective, in my own perspective, and how this was an influence. These comics were an influence on us, on my work. So, even now when we school friends meet, after a few beers, we can always have this quiz. Okay, tell me, what was this particular mythological character's wife's name, was what was his other name, and all of that. So this kind of a influence has always been there. So using that kind of work in a contemporary space is always interesting and challenging for me. And I did a similar story from about these particular comics from a lot of the children's picture charts we used to get in school. In school, we used to have these particular kind of charts. These were basically picture charts, which we could use as in our scrapbooks. They would tell you the people of India, the festivals of India, good manners, good boy versus bad boy, eating habits, all of that. They used to come in picture charts. So we would cut these out and put them in our book. So I used this kind of a material in this kind of a comic to make a story about the India I was living in, or I grew up in. Now here I use my own style with the archival material I'm living with. So here I'm using pictures and archival material, family photographs, pictures from public domain, pictures from other people. And here again, I'm trying to create a dialogue between the contemporary and the past. So for me, this is an interesting way to negotiate the lives we live in, which is often having actually a dialogue with the past. So, now this is a drawing you must have seen a while back. I've used that in a comic, and this also has a lot of archival photographs, and it's about a real person from the family. So I'm turning fact into fiction and vice versa through these works. I'm using picture charts, I'm using all of that, archival photographs, and trying to create a narrative which is actually about talking about a contemporary space which is still living in its head in the past. Yeah. Okay. So now how do we put it together? So the present makes a huge dent in my work because that's the space I'm talking about. But the past doesn't let go of it. So I use a lot of that in my work. And I put together both my memories and the metaphors these memories create in the contemporary space. For me, what is interesting is that we always negotiate with the past the way we would like to see it now. So our lenses keep changing, but the dialogue with the past never ceases. So this is the premise I begin from. When Chris Ware says I write the story with pictures, I don't illustrate the story with pictures. So this is really important, is that when we see visually, when we engage visually, then we should also write visually, because pictures actually make an editorial or a story comment. They are not accompanists, you know. For me, it's like an orchestra. You know, the oboe and the drum are playing together. They're not playing one for the other. So this is my first big book, Delhi Calm, in 2010. It talks about the space, the emergency when in 75 that happened in India. So your democratic rights were taken away, your fundamental rights were taken away, and there was a certain sense of emergency imposed, which basically meant censorship, which basically meant that the government had the free rule to rule the day. And a lot of unrest happened, but a lot of the underground dissent that happened is what the book tries to create. So I use a lot of work. I basically, as a form, I use watercolors. But again, the slide on the right, which says "keep distance, keep quiet," is actually from the state-owned buses that we used to have, and they always said. The trucks and the private vehicles and the government vehicles would always say, keep distance, keep safe. So I changed that to keep distance, keep quiet. So because you were supposed to stay quiet, you could not say anything against the government. So I use a lot of newspaper clippings. I use a lot of newspaper material, and I bring that onto my own work. I use metaphors. I used a certain fantastical space, but the space I'm talking about is very, very real. So it's like what Buñuel maybe did in his cinema, or maybe what Tarkovsky did in his cinema. Not really surreal, but something called speculative, something called fantastical, but steeped in the real. And I also acknowledge the influences I come from. So I'm using a lot of stills from cinema. I'm using a lot of stills from public domain. I'm also using a lot of stills from pop culture, from quiche. So, you know, and I'm acknowledging it. So people who know the reference might know the reference. People who might not know the reference may be helping themselves to find it out. Yeah. So I'm using, here you can see I'm using a matchbox. I'm trying to create a new kind of form here. This is particularly the text that you see behind the window is actually an obituary ad that came out the next day the emergency was imposed. There was a huge amount of censorship that imposed. There was a midnight crackdown on the newspaper offices. They were told what not to publish, what to publish. So this man cleverly put an ad in the obituary section saying Deocracy, DEM, which basically means democracy. Beloved husband of T. Ruth, truth. Loving father of L.I. Bertie, liberty. Brother of faith, hope and justice. Expired on 26 June 1975. This was a very clever way of putting it into the mainstream, a protest. So this dissent, this protest, which is underground, which is under the radar, yet makes resonance. And this is what I try to create in my work. This again is talking about censorship, is talking about this whole concept of family planning that was used. All of a sudden the government thought, okay, the population is going out of control, so let's control the population. So there was forced sterilization that was happening yeah, in the city. So this was a statement on that. So a lot of metaphors, a lot of memory keeps coming back in my work. This is an influence straight from the calendar art. The calendar art, which is also the mythological comics we're getting influenced by, is using a lot of hagiography, a lot of the gods and the goddesses and the way they were worshipped. Again, here I'm trying to say that the government of the day was actually worshipped by the police, the judiciary, by the lawmakers the same way. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of devotion and worship happening for no rhyme or reason. So I'm trying to use calendar art to make a point. Cityscapes, metaphors is something that I keep coming back to. Yeah. So what Sacco says that it's really a question of not being so centered about original purpose or the sort of allowing a story to develop in front of you. It's just a matter of giving yourself a little time to see where the story is going. So for me, that dialogue, that interaction, that thing, that engagement is very important. So even when I did this book on 70s, I was only 3 when this emergency happened. But a lot of the work that I came through, or the stories I came through, was actually through oral histories for people who had lived through that space. So for me, it is important to see how did they live through it? How did they influence? How do they remember? Even this whole act of remembering is a fascinating act. So how do I put that into a comic? I have to make it for a contemporary audience, but talking of a time which is gone, which is 30 years back. How do I make it interesting? For me, that is challenging. So one has to give that space. So this is another comic. So I keep that in mind. And the comics that I'm now talking about is about this whole space of dialogue. So this is a book about, not a book, it's a short story about me going to Lahore. Now, an Indian going to Lahore can have issues, an Indian going to Pakistan. I mean that can have a lot of issues. But here I'm talking about more peaceful times when one could go to there. And the amount of curiosity both sides have about each other, because there's an opaque wall, because we know so little about each other. So it's interesting to put that in a comic space and to know and to tell people how did it go. So I put that in a comic form, my dialogue with the officers there, the intelligence there. The intelligence follows you. They want to know what you're actually here for. They tell you. And the same goes for them who come here. So to put that in a comic form, to put that in a dialogue is very interesting for me. So these dialogues keep coming back to me. I don't want to lose them. So I put that in. Cinema is another space which is very interesting for me. I'm a film student myself. I talk about a lot of cinema in comics. Here I talk about a very interesting space in Indian cinema. Now this is nothing to do with that sense of dialogue, but is actually preceding dialogues. Now, as we know, before the talkies came in, there was a non-talkies. There was a silent era, which only had music. And this was a talkie. This particular comics actually talk about the space, the 10 or 15 years of Indian cinema, where watching a film was a visual experience. It was not a oral or a dialogue experience or a lived experience. So you would see these fascinating worlds. You would see these Syrian Jewish women, the blondes, the adventure girls, and a film around that, but no Indian girls. The concept was a visual concept of a feminist, of a feminine hero. That changed rapidly, drastically after the talkies came in. Once the talkies came in, it was about the girl next door. People wanted to watch mythological films. People wanted to watch musicals based on Hindu rituals and mythologies and legends. So all of a sudden, that whole genre went out of the window. And the short girl next door who could sing very well came down. So the concept of cinema changed. So for me, this particular phase was an interesting phase, and I talked about this in this particular comic. not as anything else, but because cinema really fascinates me. So I try to engage with as many forms that fascinate me and bring that into the comic, as you said, as you saw in the video, the pamphlet, the theater, the song, all of that keeps coming back to the comic, as you will see.
Mr. Ghosh,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. So it's almost 4:45, maybe 5 more minutes, and we can wrap it up. So we have time for questions.
Okay, so yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you. So I'm talking about contemporary space. As you can see here, I'm using a lot of folk art because I'm often told about that, India has such a rich folk art tradition, but why don't we use it? So I said, okay, let me use it in a contemporary way instead of giving it in any other way. So I talk about a family, I talk about a whole space of celebration through folk art. I talk about a lot of work of the politics around me, and I try to use poetry. I try to use long form in that. I also try to use a lot of video in my material. I make stills out of the video and I put that into a comic. So I try and use as many different works. So as Joe Sacco says, every process is different. Every book has a different process. So this is a book that I came up with, this side, that side. It talks about the partition. Now, it's interesting for me to talk about comics in an academic space because a lot of the work we often see is that comics are talked about as children's medium. It's not meant for adults. But when we talked about the partition, a lot of the PhD scholars wanted their papers to be sent in, but they said, but it's for children. Our papers will get diluted. I said, why don't you send it and let's see how it goes? Because a lot of the work that happens is actually negotiating visuals. I will come back to this video later. So extending that practice through different forms is what fascinates me. I also try and work a lot of comics for social issues. I talk about gender, I talk about hand washing through comics for an audience in India, which is neoliterate, which is more visually oriented than text oriented. And I try using comics for them. And I try reading those comics in rural spaces and before they read it out for themselves. This is a project that I'm really working on right now. As we know, there's a whole lot of migrant issue that is happening in India right now. After the lockdown, a lot of the labor has actually gone back to their villages. I am talking about the labor which was actually living in those villages, in the cities, and how they talk about their own homes. So here I'm talking about the labor actually talking to us through their own homes, of the homes they've left, and they draw their own maps. And through their own maps, they tell us the story of their own homes. So these are the drawings they have come up with. And I engage with them through these drawings. And then they tell me the stories of their own homes, which for me is fascinating. And I document that. And this is a project that I'm working on as of now. A lot of this labor has actually now left for the villages and are hopefully coming back. So these are the people I'm in touch with and I'm working on. And I've been working on this for almost 5 years now. I don't know where it's going, but I'm working on it, yeah. So eventually it's all about storytelling. We keep engaging with storytelling through visuals, through dialogues, through text. And this is where I am. And for me, this is the fascinating space of engaging of comics through dialogues. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ghosh, for such an insightful and interesting talk. I'm sure all our presenters and viewers have actually enjoyed it very much. We have some time now for questions and feedback. I'm going to be checking the chat if some of the participants, but with this, I would like to start with a reflection that you just mentioned, how the power of storytelling. You also mentioned the instructional dimension, but through your brief introduction, if you could reflect a little bit more on how graphic and comic art, how is a dynamic practice, right? That really combines the creative power of the arts to be able to move us emotionally, with the strategic narrative, so to say, right, that is necessary to bring about reflection to a reflection that can trigger critical thinking, can trigger social change. Especially in this eclectic dimension that you have mentioned, and you have very nicely walked us through all the different materials, how you draw on your own influences, well, and also this interesting blending between fiction and
non-fiction, yeah,
and non-fiction and facts that you mentioned.
So you know, at one level, graphic novel, drawing a graphic narrative is actually a matter of strategy. So how do you negotiate between the visual and the thing? What is the thing that the visual will say and the words will not say? How do you engage an audience which is actually interested? Because, you know, the way we are wired is we want to read and we want to move to the next page. We don't really want to engage with the visuals. So what are the details that you will leave out in the frames, in the visuals, is something matter of strategy, so that you can engage with them visually. What do you want to do at the end of the day? You want to draw the reader into that particular space. If you're drawing that camp, if you're drawing that home, if you're drawing that room, you want to make him sit in that room. So what are the points of identification will you leave for him to come and engage with him? He should see first and then read later. You should actually first engage with that space and then read what is happening, what is being said, what is the person speaking. So for me, that is very important. How do I construct the world? And most of graphic novelists actually first look into that. How do you construct the world before you bring it? If I'm talking about my life in Delhi, you wouldn't know about it in Spain. And if you're talking about your life in Madrid, I don't know much about it besides a football club, maybe, you know. So, you know, but the daily life, how do you draw me in? It's about the world you will create. So I will know, okay, how much are the potatoes costing in your supermarket today? Where is the world going? And so, you know, I would like to know, how is the world engaging and how am I fitting into it? So I need to fit into your world. So it's actually, your question that you put on is very interesting. It's actually a two-way process. The reader has to be converted into being a participant, much as he or she has to be willing to be a part of it. You know? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a question on our chat. Okay, so this is a question. I read Delhi Count and I really enjoyed it. Since you mentioned that your objective was first to become an illustrator and children comics books, what made you change the path and engage you in a historical political story?
Two things. One was that if you're as a children's illustrator, I thought I'm still telling someone else's story. And most of the books that kind of keep coming out are basically retellings of mythological stories in the Indian market. Or there's a space for textbooks. I did textbooks as a college student. I did a lot of illustrated a lot of textbooks for children to get myself that extra beer or you know, or pay for my education or something. But what I thought was interesting is that to tell my own story, comics and graphic novels are a far more dynamic space. That's the biggest this thing. If I have to tell my own contemporary story, it has to be through comics and not through a children's book in that sense. The other question, I think there's another question. What do you think of Indira Gandhi?
Yeah, what do you think about Indira Gandhi, a historical figure, and her role in the history of India?
Okay. Well, you know, I mean, India just celebrated, just observed her birthday yesterday. You know, I grew up when she was there. So for me, she was always a historical, a living figure who would come on to your news every night on the dinner table. So for me, that was the engagement I had. But in terms of how do I see her as a historical figure, I think it's a mixed bag. I think a lot of the movement that the democracy changed in our country was during her tenure. The fact that democracy was challenged was during her tenure. The fact that India became a world power in the sense of that it stood on its own ground was also because of in her tenure. So I think it's a mixed bag. I have a mixed opinion about her space, but I also definitely feel that a lot of the Indian democracy, the nature of Indian democracy changed during her tenure, and not all of that was really that was really that held ground for a long time, or could have taken us forward. Yeah.
I have a comment on our YouTube channel, and well, it wants to congratulate of your talk, and that it really is very, very good the way you used different tools and different materials to create hybrid content that that is looking for a social change. There is another comment. He wants to say thank you, that it was a really interesting talk, and it has a question. Who are the readers of graphic novels in India, created in English, I imagine? Do they have any specific audience?
Well, you know, graphic novels in India is less than 10 years old, or no, actually 15 years old, yeah. So it's something that is being worked on. It's something that we are trying to work on. It's still, I would say, a nascent medium in India. Graphic novels across the world have a much smaller readership. That is true. But the readers who are trying, who are exploring this medium has started with one graphic novel, then they moved on to another, and now they have become graphic novel readers. So it's not that they are not reading anything else, but they're also reading graphic novels, which is a great space for us. A lot of the young kids are reading graphic novels, which is a great sense of hope for us. But I have also realized that to create new readers, we also need to create new writers. So we also engage with a lot of people who are not writing graphic novels, but we tried. So even in the anthology, the partition anthology that I worked with, I was trying to convert a lot of poets, serious academic researchers, to think about their own work, own their practice from a graphic novel perspective, from a visual perspective, and how would they engage with it. That would create another form of readership, because people who read poetry could also now read graphic novels, and vice versa. So for me, that is very interesting and challenging, is to keep creating these micro worlds of readerships, and hopefully we get them to read, and hopefully we get them to write, and now that is happening. So a lot of other people who never wrote graphic novels or ever read graphic novels are writing graphic novels. So for me, which is very interesting. Yeah.
Very good. We almost are crossing the finishing line of this session, but we have a few minutes, and there is one more question. That says that, well, it's from Asunción, that, well, he wants to congratulate on the lecture, and that she has a question regarding the social impact of your graphic narratives. You have mentioned some of your social projects in which you are now involved. And so in which ways can graphic narratives can influence social change? Are comics considered serious narratives in India? Are they used for education, or what level? I know maybe it's a big question. If you can summarize it.
So I will put it this way. See, comics on its own are not really considered serious narratives anywhere in the world. You know, graphic novels maybe are. So the readership for that is different from the comics we would create for social change and behavior. So a lot of the comics that we use in our work is actually meant for a new literate audience, the audience in our semi-urban rural spaces who have just about learned to read. Now, a lot of this would be the first generation reader or the second generation reader. In times like we live in, you know, you'll be surprised to know that a simple comic on how to use soap, how to wash hands, The COVID protocols, social distancing, keep washing your hands 20 times a day for 20 seconds, can go a long way if you use comics. Because children read comics, they take it back home, they keep it in their homes, their parents read out of curiosity. We have done a lot of work like that on gender, on cases like domestic violence, which is all across the subcontinent. We've used a lot of comics because these young girls or these young boys would take it home, the father would read it and think about it. So, it works through different levels. So it's not that one comic will actually make a change. One comic will make the reader think. That's what we think. So we are using a lot of picture books, a lot of comics especially for the COVID space, for a new literate audience, for a rural audience, where basically we're trying to tell them to wash hands with soap, use clean water for drinking, maintain distance from each other. So it has an impact, it has a visual impact, and then it has a secondary impact that stays on you, which leads to change. The work we do in graphic novels is probably different and has a different thing. So we use graphic novels for change for another kind of audience. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for such a steering, enlightened, insightful conversation. And well, it's already time to finish our opening talk. And again, thank you so much. It's been a true honor having you with us today. And thank you to all our participants and all our viewers. And on behalf of the organizing committee, we truly hope that you enjoy the panels and the sessions throughout the 3-day conference. So tink you so much. Best regards.
I just would like to thank you. I would just like to thank each of you and Xiana, you and Asun and all our organizers and what was his name? I'm forgetting his name.
The dean,
yes.
Eugenio, yes, and then Juan Antonio, the coordinator.
Yeah.
Don't worry, we couldn't even pronounce your name. So
yeah, he's been a great help.
Let's hope. Let's hope we continue this dialogue, and we can see each other again very soon.
Very soon. Okay, and please be safe. Maintain social distancing and breathe easy. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you.